Good morning, everyone. Nice to see you all. Thank you so much, as always, for joining. As per the usual format, I've muted everyone, but obviously, if you want to make any comments, ask anything, please feel free to unmute yourselves. The topic we were looking at is that of DeRabbanans, the rabbinic, the authority of Chazal, the sages, or perhaps even later generations, to create rabbinic decrees, to create DeRabbanans, whether these are gzeras, fences, so-called fences built around the Torah, or takonas, new mitzvahs that are innovated. And really the essence of what I wanted to capture in this topic is to bring out the degree to which we take DeRabbanans for granted, and yet they are not obvious concepts at all. We spent a fair amount of time, several weeks, looking at Torah SheBaal, the oral law, the ability of human beings to interpret the Torah. We're not talking here about interpretation, we're talking about innovation, but the wonder of a DeRabbanan remains. If we think about the very punchline of where we got to when we discussed Torah SheBaal, the concluding shir, which I used as an opportunity to speak about one of Rabbi Sachs's ideas, really built on the Mon Avuchim, was taking Torah SheBaal to its limits and discussing the idea of us as receivers of the Torah, being able to bring insight and innovation that's genuinely new, not necessarily within the context of the Torah itself, as per the idea of applying the Torah to our times. Now, when one hears those ideas, clearly there's several thoughts that occur. The first is this opens a can of worms, what are the limits? But the second thing that occurs is this sounds almost troubling in concept. How can it be that we as human beings are innovating a code of conduct, a law, a moral application or sensitivity that didn't exist previously? But in essence, that's what every DeRabbanan is. One can ask oneself the same question on every DeRabbanan. What do you mean Chazal created a new halacha? If the Torah didn't include it, if God didn't say this on Sinai, then who do we think we are to innovate it? It's inherent in the concept of a DeRabbanan is that Jewish chutzpah of understanding our receipt of the Torah as being, as including in it the opportunity for us to genuinely innovate. How is this not a contradiction to Torah Hashem T'mila, the idea of the perfection of the Torah, as many asked after I shared that share on different approaches to slavery and new moral sensitivities? The answer is, as the Rambam says in his Mon Avuchim, it's not God who's changing, it's us who's changing. Us human beings develop and change in our insight and our appreciation and our understanding. So what we take for granted when we talk about the idea of a DeRabbanan is in truth a very innovative concept. The idea that a human being can change and alter and create halacha is not something we should take for granted. Now, we saw last week a number of sources regarding this idea. We saw the Rambam in Hilchos Mamrim, who based really on a Gemara in Shabbos, understands that the authority of the DeRabbanan Shabbos Kaf Gimel in the context of Hanukkah, which is fast approaching, the Gemara there says that how can we make Asher Gedushanim Mitzvosov V'tzivonu? How can we say we were commanded by Hashem to do a mitzvah DeRabbanan? We know the mitzvah of Hanukkah historically is an action, it's a rabbinic mitzvah. How can it be that we are commanded by Hashem? How can we say that? Answers the Gemara, because the source of rabbinic authority is really from the Torah, and it brings two sources for this: either lo sosor, do not veer off what they teach you, or a pasuk that we may have taken more poetically in Ha'azinu, she'alo vicha v'yagedecha zekinecha v'yomulach, ask your elders, ask your parents, and they will tell you, they will teach you, giving authority to the elders of the nation to instruct us. So says the Gemara there. Now, the Rambam brings this in his Hilchos Mamrim. The concept of Hilchos Mamrim is a section of halacha dealing with, we could call it conscientious objection, what do you do when you think the courts have got things wrong? And the Rambam there discusses the authority of the central court, the Beis Din HaGadol in Yerushalayim, the Supreme Court, what we would nowadays call the Sanhedrin in Yerushalayim, which the Rambam says is Ikar Torah She'Ba'al Peh. It's a harder phrase to translate. The essence of the Torah She'Ba'al Peh. Amudei Hara, they are the pillars of ruling. And the Rambam therefore says this is the source of authority when we learn Torah She'Ba'al Peh, when we want to question the authority of rabbinic law of Torah She'Ba'al Peh. I just perhaps will share the screen momentarily with you again, just have a look at these wonderful words of the Rambam because they are really important as a source. You should be able to see the Rambam up. Beis Din HaGadol, these are the opening words of the Rambam in his laws of Mamrim. Beis Din HaGadol Sheb'Yerushalayim, the Supreme Court in Jerusalem. Heim Ikar Torah She'Ba'al Peh, they are the essence of the oral law. Ve'im Amudei Hara, they are the pillars of ruling. Mehem Chok or Mishpat L'Yotze L'Chad Yisrael. Out of them comes justice and statutes for all of Israel. Now the Rambam is saying a lot of things here, not all of which we are going to discuss today. He's saying there's a number of functions to the Beit Din HaGadol, to the Sanhedrin. One of them is rulership, interpretation perhaps linked to the concepts we were discussing previously of the ability of humans to interpret the Torah. But then he says, in Halacha Base, at the bottom of the page, Kol mi she'eina osa kaharasan, anyone who doesn't follow their instruction, over below sase, transgresses a negative commandment, lo sosun kol hadava, don't veer off what they say. And then he includes in this lo soso not just interpretation, but also things which they innovate. Echad devarim shalomdum epidatom. It is the same whether these are things which they learn through their own reason, through their own interpretation, the echad devarim shasam siyog l'Torah, and same it's whether these are things which are barriers or fences around the Torah, what we would call classic DeRabbanans. So this is what the Rambam says, that even classic DeRabbanans have Torah authority and are imposed upon us, if you like, through the law of Torah itself. Now, based on questioning that I had after the shir, I want to point out one parameter which I neglected to point out in the last shir, which is quite possibly, the Rambam only grants this authority to rabbinic instruction about laws which are created by the Beit Din HaGadol in Yerushalayim. The Rambam, if one looks at what he just says, and this is why I wanted us to relearn this piece together, it is quite possible, though not definite, that the view of the Rambam is that this is authority granted only to the Supreme Court in Yerushalayim, not to later rabbinic legislation. On the other hand, the Rambam includes in this category even minhagim, even customs, which would seem to imply those which develop later also. So there remains some lack of clarity as to the extent or the parameters of what the Rambam would say applies to this particular law. Who is it who has this authority to create rabbinic law? Is it only the Beis Din HaGadol? There is a piece from Rav Soloveitchik, which I don't want to go into too much at length today, who discusses the role of the Beit HaMikdash. We're very used to thinking of the Beit HaMikdash as being the place within which korbanos, sacrifices, are offered. However, in the Beit HaMikdash, in the Aron, was also stored the luchas, the tablets given to Moshe on Har Sinai. And the Gemara in Yuma discusses what happened to these tablets after the Chorban Beis HaMikdash, and whether they were located even in the era of the second temple of the Beis HaMikdash by Sheni in the Kodesh Kodashim, or some chamber underneath it. And the Rambam paskins that the current location of the luchos remains in the second Beis HaMikdash, even in the second Beis HaMikdash in the temple itself, which Rav Soloveitchik points out indicates that he doesn't view this as just a historical issue, but one with halachic significance, meaning the essence of the Beis HaMikdash in this view is only one with the luchos there. The Beis HaMikdash is only invested with its kedusha, its sanctity, and if it houses the Mishkan Ha'edus, as the pasuk tells us, the psukim tell us this. The Mishkan, the Beis Hamikdash, is described as Mishkan Ha'edus, the luchas which house the luchas Ha'edus. That's how Rashi at least translates this phrase. The Beis Hamikdash, by its very definition, is the house of the luchas. Kimitzion Teitzei Torah. From Sion, from the Beis Hamikdash, Torah derives its authority. So this is the source of the Beis Hamikdash. Again, I'm not going to go into details, but he discusses there something we spoke about and perhaps we could visit in this series. When we look at the text of the Torah itself and how accurate the transmission of the Torah itself is, the source of authority for the text of the Torah was the Sefer Torah stored there in the Beis Hamikdash. So the Beis Hamikdash is not just the location of Korbanos, but it's also the central location of the authority of Torah Shebichsav and Torah SheBaal Peh, hence it being the location of the meeting point of the Beis Din HaGadol, the Supreme Court, as the Rambam told us, and the primary function, as the Rambam explains in Hilchos Mamrim that we just read, of the Beis Din HaGadol is the preservation of the Masorah of Torah SheBaal Peh and the enaction of DeRabbanans. By the way, this is indicated in the language we say in davening. We say Yehiratzon at the end of the Shemona Etzra, Yehiratzon V'Lufnecha, etc. She'iboneh Beis Hamikdash V'Mheri V'Yameinu. The Beis Hamikdash should be rebuilt. V'Sein Chalkeinu B'Sorasecha, and give us our share in the Torah, seeming to indicate that the share in the Torah only exists when Yiboneh Beis Hamikdash, when the Beis Hamikdash is rebuilt. So the link between Beis Hamikdash, the Beis Din HaGadol, in the Talmud of the temple, and the authority of the sages may be more significant than perhaps I pointed out last week. Either way, in terms of the essence of our discussion, the Rambam's view is that the authority of Chazal, of the sages, is granted to us by Rabbinic, by Torah authority derived from Sukkim in the Torah. Now, the evidence of this is the language of the pasuk in of the brachas that we say v'tzivanu. We say berachas haTorah when we learn a sugya DeRabbanan, for example Chanukah or Erevin. Even though we are only learning rabbinic mitzvahs, nonetheless we say berachas haTorah. We treat these as fully divrei Torah. In fact, maybe they are even more significantly divrei Torah than regular divrei Torah. So this would seem to imply this has the status of Torah in the fullest sense of the word. Nonetheless, there are a number of difficulties with this. We see, for example, if there's a clash between a positive DeRabbanan and a Torah prohibition, the DeRabbanan trumps against the general rule of asay doicha lo saseh. So we see that rabbinic law has a weaker authority than normal Torah law. In addition, we know that when one has a sofek, when one has a situation of doubt, normally when it's Torah law, we say sofek d'oraisa l'chumra, situation of doubt around Torah law is following the stringent possibility. However, a situation of doubt with rabbinic law follows the lenient opinion. Similarly, the punishment, the onesh, the penalty given for transgression of rabbinic law is less than that of Torah law, and so on and so forth. We also find that in chiyuv d'Rabbanan, a rabbinic obligation cannot be mitzi, cannot exempt a chiyuv d'oraisa Torah obligation. For example, if one has eaten a kazayis of bread, an olive-sized portion of bread one has to bench. Nonetheless, the pasuk says v'chalta v'savata. The Torah obligation to bench is only if one's eaten a full portion. And again, someone who has eaten a full portion of food, kadei severe, to satiation, can exempt someone else who is obligated to bench. But if one has only eaten a rabbinic portion of food, a kazayis, such that one's obligation to bench is only DeRabbanan, one cannot exempt someone who has done a Torah, who has a Torah obligation. So these are all questions on the view of the Rambam, who seems to treat rabbinic law as Torah law. Now, there's several answers, several ways to defend the Rambam. I haven't gone into details, by the way, of sources. I should perhaps point out that all these questions are asked against the Rambam by his critics, those who disagree with him, in particular the Ramban. The Rambam writes about these matters in his Sefer HaMitzvahs, his book of mitzvahs. The Rambam wrote many works. His principal halachic work is Mishnah Torah. His principal philosophical work is Moreh Nevuchim, but he wrote many other lesser philosophical works and lesser halachic works. Amongst his other halachic works is a sort of introduction to Mishnah Torah called the Sefer HaMitzvahs, the list of 613 commandments. It's a separate work, but the Rambam wrote it as a way of introducing his halachic work. In his introduction to these 613 commandments, he writes a number of rules about how he categorizes mitzvahs and other such matters. And there he speaks at length about his view that mitzvahs DeRabbanan are from Torah obligation. He attacks the more extreme version of this, which is the Bahag. The Bahag, the Baal Halachas Gedolos, which I mentioned last week, of Gaonic authority, lists the rabbinic mitzvahs, or at least some of them, as amongst the 613 commandments. And the Rambam says, "One minute, this has gone too far. You cannot claim these are of the 613 commandments, but I do agree they have Torah authority from Luzzatto." The Rambam, Nachmanides, wrote a critique of the Rambam's list of 613 mitzvahs. And in that critique, he also challenges this idea that mitzvahs DeRabbanan all have Torah authority. And he asks many of the questions we have asked. We will look at in more detail, hopefully still this week, and in the weeks to come, the alternative view of the Ramban. But in the meantime, what would the Rambam say? How would he explain how he can believe that rabbinic mitzvahs have Torah authority and yet behave in a very different manner to Torah laws, such as in the scenario of Sofek, doubt, where we follow the lenient option with DeRabbanans and the stringent option with Doraisas? And the Rambam's answer to this question is that the Rabbanon, the rabbinic sages, in the very essence of making rabbinic legislation, using their Torah-given authority to so do, created also the rules of how these rabbinic legislations should behave. And they themselves said when they created this DeRabbanan that it should behave differently to Torah obligation. When it comes to Torah law, we follow the stringent option. When it comes to rabbinic law, even though our authority is granted to us by the Torah, nonetheless, we don't wish to equate our legislation with Torah legislation. And therefore, we allow various leniencies to creep in, including in the punishments granted, including in what to do in a situation of doubt, and so on and so forth. So the Chazal realized they were walking a narrow line when they created Rabbanans. We've already discussed the innovation inherent in a Rabbanan is an extraordinary one. It's the idea that we humans can change and alter the halachic system as is appropriate for our time. Chazal were conscious that this potentially can clash with the prohibition in the Torah of Baal Tosif, Lo Tosif Alav, Devorim chapter 13, and therefore built in various leniencies in order to identify and make clear that this is not ultimately Torah law, including the idea that Sofek DeRabbanan Hakel, that in a situation of doubt, one can follow the lenient opinion. Indeed, this leads me to the next point I wanted to make. Someone texted me, emailed me during the week, asking how does the Rambam stance read rabbinic innovations and grouping them with rabbinic innovations and viewing them as having Torah authority, ultimately fit with the pasuk, the prohibition of Lo Tosif or of Baal Tosif. And the Rambam answers this himself. He asks this and answers this himself in a brief comment he makes after listing a summary of the 613 mitzvahs. And he says, Baal Tosif, the prohibition of adding commandments to Torah, is when someone, a sage or a prophet, claims that God himself has added a mitzvah to the Torah. In other words, some form of, if you like, ongoing revelation in which Hashem himself will alter a mitzvah. However, if it's only DeRabbanan, meaning Chazal, the innovator of this commandment, are very clear that this is a rabbinic addition, rather than being Torah commandment, then this is no prohibition of Baal Tosif. Baal Tosif means to claim ongoing revelation in the sense of Hashem himself commanding a new mitzvah. However, if it's us claiming rabbinically because of adjusting to human needs, then this wouldn't be in prohibition of Baal Tosif. So says the Rambam in his brief comment at the end of listing the summary of the mitzvahs. So this is another remarkable idea of the Rambam. Nonetheless, the sages, Chazal, were sensitive to the dangers of creating rabbinic commandments, and therefore they themselves built into the system that in a situation of doubt, one can follow the more lenient option. That would answer part of the questions. What about the idea that someone who is obligated in a rabbinic commandment cannot be motzi, cannot exempt someone who is obligated in a Torah commandment? Well, here there's a very logical piece of reasoning that explains this. If I am benching because of the Torah obligation to bench, because I've eaten, for example, kadei seviyah, to satiation, the mitzvah I'm fulfilling is that of Birchas Hamazon. And therefore my obligation is v'achalta v'svata uveirachta, that I have to bench. If, however, I am benching because of the rabbinic obligation to bench, because of the verse that instructs me to listen to DeRabbanan, it is true I'm fulfilling a Torah obligation, but the Torah obligation I'm fulfilling is very sosul, not to deviate from that which the rabbis teach us. Sha'alavicha, listen to the seats of authority of the Zakanim, of the elders of the generation. So the mitzvah I'm doing is a different mitzvah, if you like, to Birchas Hamazon. It is true I can say V'tzivanu l'hadlik ner shel Chanukah when I'm doing a rabbinic mitzvah, but the mitzvah, the authority of the mitzvah, true it is the Torah authority, but the Torah authority is that of listening to the sages as opposed to benching itself, and therefore someone who is benching rabbinically obligated because of the kazayis cannot argue, cannot exempt someone who is fulfilling the mitzvah because of the Torah obligation to bench. So this would be the view of the Rambam, and understanding his position that the authority of the sages is derived from Torah law. And before we look at the alternative stance, I'll pause just in case there's any comments anyone wants to make. Otherwise, we will move on. But this is the way the Ramban understands it.
Why do we therefore have the particular problem, given we've got Bayomim Haim, of the difficulty of overriding previous generations?
The issue of overriding previous generations is one of how the system works, meaning that there's two ways of understanding the halachic concept of Yeridas Hadoros, of the so-called decline of the generation, which removes our authority to override previous generations. One way is a conceptual way, that there's a genuine diminution in Torah learning and status. The Rambam does not adopt this stance. The reason the Rambam doesn't adopt this stance is because of what we've been speaking about till now, that the Rambam is of the view that each generation can possess elements of insight which previous generations didn't possess. The Rambam understands this simply to be a matter of legal system functioning, that without a Sanhedrin in operation, without a Beis Din HaGadol in operation, without the ability to thresh out issues in a combined and unified manner, legally we don't have the mechanism to debate previous generations. The Rambam gives a very functional definition of this. For example, the authority of the Gemara, the Rambam says, is built on the fact that in the era of the Gemara, there was a genuine joined-up conversation taking place. There was a historical fluke, that all centers of Torah learning were to be found in Bovel, and the yeshivas were engaged in constant communication and debate, and therefore one arrived at a halachic opinion, which was that arose from the whole of the Jewish people. Were we to be able to restore a system where we could all engage without the differences in the traditions of the different ways of addressing such topics, then in principle we could arrive at similar authority. What was unique about Chasimas HaTalmud, the conclusion of the Talmudic era, was that this was the point at which, and this is a historical fact, the centers of Jewish learning spread outwards from Bavel to the rest of, to many other areas of the Jewish world, to Spain, to Germany, to Italy, to North Africa, to other parts of the Middle East. And therefore, we no longer had a sort of collective debate taking place in the Jewish world. So there's two ways of understanding our lack of authority relative to previous generations. One is because of a genuine diminution in our Masorah, and our tradition, and our insight into Torah, and the other is a legal mechanism as to the nature of debate and conversation and authority, and how laws that are enacted maintain their authority. The Rambam adopting, it would appear, the latter consistent with his general view around these topics. So this is a separate issue. But now that we have rabbinic authority, the Rambam is of the view that this rabbinic authority is granted by the Torah, perhaps only to the Beis Gadol, perhaps to any rabbinic authority, as the case might be. I see also on the group a number of questions have been posted in chat. Rebal Tosif Noam wrote, now the kavanah becomes very important in cases where something is a sophic DeRabbanan, deraisa. If you get the kavanah wrong, thinking it was deraisa, then you're in Baal Tosif territory. No, that is an excellent point, as all the points you raise are. The Rambam, in his words in his brief introduction to Mishnah Torah, is a little unclear as to this point. I was actually thinking about whether we should learn these words inside, but I didn't want to in the interest of time. I'll post on the group the text of the Rambam so that you can look at it yourself and form your own judgment. Your question, Noam, is a little unclear in the. Oh, I see. It's oh no, okay, it's legible in the chat group. So I'll just post that in the chat group. The question itself is a little unclear as to what the degree of what the Rambam means by this. Is it dependent on every performer's intention as to whether they need to understand the difference between whether this is a deraisa or DeRabbanan, or the Rambam is making a legislative point? As long as it is legislated appropriately, that is sufficient. But your comment, Noam, is excellent, and the subject of a lot of debate as to whether the Rambam means that each performer of a mitzvah needs to understand the concept. Darren also posts an excellent question here. How do we understand cases where the Rabbanon override deraisa, such as not blowing shofar when Rosh Hashanah falls on Shabbos? The answer is, in theory, when they wish to do so, they have the authority to do so, at least to the extent of shev va'al ta'aseh. Remain passive and don't act. In other words, whether they can command one to transgress a prohibition is a more complicated matter if they chose to exercise their authority, but certainly they have the ability and chose to exercise their authority when it comes to shev v'al ta'aseh, to remaining passive as opposed to active. So this is another point, and also a very important point. Whether it's a choice or a limit to authority is an interesting question, but they have the ability to, it would appear they have the ability to nullify Torah law, at least in the context of passive behavior. Don't do a mitzvah as opposed to transgress a mitzvah. Okay, so these are, deals with the questions that have been posted. This is the view of the Rambam around mitzvahs min HaTorah, mitzvahs DeRabbanan. Now, we are, however, in a catch-22 situation, because if we choose to argue on the Rambam and adopt the view of the Ramban, who disagrees with the Rambam and believes that Torah authority is granted, that Rabbanon do not have Torah authority, what then is the source of rabbinic authority? Why do we have to listen to them at all? So before we go further, I want to share on the screen the view of the Ramban, Nachmanides, who adopts a very different stance to the Rambam and takes the view that the Rabbanon do not have rabbinic authority, Torah authority for their legislation, who disagrees with the Rambam about this. And this is really a very important source. And the question that Ramban Nachmanides poses on the Rambam is one we always need to be aware of when we claim greater authority than we really have. Let's just have a look at the words of the Ramban over here. Hasogas HaRamban the Sefer HaMitzvahs. This the critiques, the criticisms of the Rambam against the Book of Commandments, the Sefer HaMitzvahs of the Rambam. V'nei harav boineh chomer. The Rav, meaning the Rambam, builds a wall. The Rambam, by the way, always spoke respectfully towards those he criticized. Many of you will be familiar with the genre of criticism, critiques. It's a whole section of Torah in which one senior rabbinic authority will criticize another, like the Ra'avad against the Rambam and other such sources. Sometimes they use very critical language. The Ramban, in general, is respectful to his opponents. He'll say his view emphatically and strongly, but not in a way that could be understood to be disparaging. In his commentary to the Torah, he particularly takes to task the Ibn Ezra, and he writes in his introduction that you should realize that my techach, my rebuke of the Ibn Ezra is revealed, but my love is there underlying everything I say. The Rambam is very careful how he critiques his opponents. So now he writes against the Rambam. The Rav, the Rambam, he builds a high wall around the words of the sages. But it is like a breach which can fall in a wall, which can suddenly collapse. Because it is a lacking svara based upon most of the sources in the Talmud. So the Rambam is saying is that if you claim a too great authority, you build a wall too high, then it risks collapse, it risks being weaker. Not always is a heavier, higher, thicker wall a better security for the fence, for the town that you wish to protect. Sometimes you overbuild and it becomes overburdened and it collapses suddenly. It's a general concept. I'm not going to discuss now all its implications about when one builds walls that are too high, perhaps in the interest of that which one thinks one is protecting, one ends up weakening it. It is clear, that which is clear from all mistake, that the prohibition of loisoso is only in their interpretive role, not in their innovative role, and so goes on the Rambam. Okay, so the Rambam is of the view that it is true that the Gemara tells us that the Beis Din HaGadol or the sages have been granted authority. However, excuse me, this is authority to interpret. This is not authority to legislate. Legislative authority to create new laws is not a Torah right. It's not something granted from Torah law. Interpretive authority is what we're talking about over here. So the Rambam clashes head-on with the Rambam, and he believes that interpretation is the remit of the sages of the Talmud and later scholars perhaps. However, innovation and legislation is not a right granted to them as far as Torah law of Luzzatto at least is concerned. Now, this resolves the difficulties on the Rambam because the Rambam blurred the boundaries between Torah law and Rabbinic law, as we saw. And the Rambam understood that even Rabbinic law has Torah authority. So great, we've resolved that issue. However, we find ourselves trapped on the horns of a dilemma, because the opposite model is also problematic. If indeed this is true, that Rabbanon do not have Torah-granted authority, then what is their source of authority? The Rambam said that all DeRabbanan is deraisa, which the Rambam was not prepared to accept. But if it isn't deriving authority from the Torah, what is the authority of the sages? How can we say that he commanded us to do a mitzvah if the Chazal, if the sages don't have the authority to do this? What makes learning DeRabbanan's Torah? What makes learning DeRabbanan's having Torah authority at all? So this is the opposite problem in the Rambam, which is what is the authority of the Rabbanon? Fine, you've created a clear divide between Torah and Rabbinic law, but in that case, what is the authority that they have? So this is a very important question. And again, it brings our discussion back to some of the ideas that we've been speaking about when we speak about the authority of Torah itself and the role of Chazal. And to the best of my knowledge, 2 or perhaps 3 different schools of thought, ways of resolving and understanding rabbinic authority have been suggested. And I want to stress that these are all suggestions. To the best of my knowledge, there are not clear sources in the Rishonim, bar perhaps the Ritva, that really address this question head on. And I will try and just share what I understand of this topic. But just to summarize, the question facing us is, if the authority of the sages is not Torah granted, what is their authority? And this discussion leads, I promise you, to a most fascinating issue. Something that, again, perhaps we don't think about enough, but it is absolutely eye-opening. Because to resolve this problem, we perhaps need to think about what the concept of authority means at all. And there are a number of models for authority, including a moral model of authority. I owe someone a moral debt. Legal model of authority, perhaps the rights that a king or a government have over me. Contractual models of authority, in which I accept authority upon myself. And wisdom model of authority, in which someone has authority by dint of their ability, of expertise that they possess, as opposed to a legal or moral authority. So we use the word authority in many ways. We may, for example, say someone has rabbinic authority or medical authority. Do we mean by that that they have a legal ability to impose upon me their view? If someone is a medical authority, or indeed a historian, who has a historical authority, we often mean by that authority that they have a mastery of their fields and of particular expertise. We may then speak about authority, perhaps in the sense of kibbud of aim, parental authority, which may not have legal authority, but maybe has a moral authority. So we need to actually think about authority when we are discussing this issue over here. And in fact, the first and earlier question that we need to ask ourselves is, what is the authority of God himself? What is the authority of the Torah itself? Why do I need to listen to Torah itself? In other words, at this point in time, we're asking ourselves, why do I need to listen to DeRabbanan? But actually, what is the answer to the question of why I need to listen to Torah law itself? Why is it that I need to listen to what the Torah has to say? Maybe that's the more basic question we may need to answer. Now, I may be tempted to answer, well, what do you mean? Of course we have to listen to what Hashem said. Hashem is the God. He is our king. He is our boss. Of course we need to listen to him. However, the answer to that question isn't so simple. If we take the authority of the Torah, why do we need to listen to mitzvahs in the Torah? Because Hashem commanded us. We can then ask another question, which is, and therefore, so what? Because he commanded us, why do we have to listen to what he says? And if your answer to the question will be because Hashem commanded, then you end up with something circular. Is a command of Hashem something self-reinforcing? Does it carry its own weight? Or does it rely on weight which precedes it, which comes ahead of it? Does it rely on some sort of authority which exists above and beyond Torah itself? So this is one question. What is the authority that the Torah is granted? Why do I need to listen to Hashem? Now, a common answer given to this question, and one which I think is incorrect, is, well, if you don't listen, he will punish you. Now, this may be true or may be untrue. Think back to our series on Olam Haba and how we understood the concept of the world to come. Maybe the punishment is a automatic result or implication rather than a sort of authoritarian figure. However, punishment itself isn't really a route to authority. Punishment simply means it is practical and logical to listen, otherwise I'll get beaten up. A mafia prince dominating a town, a criminal in charge of a town, it may make sense for me as a little weakling to listen to their instructions. But this is no true authority. This is simply bowing to the fear of being beaten up. So unless we are happy to adopt the model of Torah authority as being that of the big bully with a capital B in the sky, what do we mean by granting authority to the Torah? Is it simply a pragmatic model of avoiding punishment and gaining reward? And if that is so, does the Torah carry true moral content? It turns out that I'm the same in principle as the person who chooses to ignore Torah. We are both making a pragmatic cheshbon calculation as to how to maximize my pleasure. He simply believes, or she simply believes, that the way to do so is by partying and drinking and having a good life. And I believe that there's a God out there who will beat me up if I don't behave, and I wish to avoid punishment, and therefore I listen to Torah. This seems a poor basis to grant authority to the Torah. There is an alternative model over here, in which the reason the Torah has authority is because that which is there in the Torah is morally correct and the right thing to do. Again, though, this model, though possible, poses difficulties, because it turns out that I'm listening to the Torah not because of authority, but simply because it is a moral code which contains within it wisdom of morality. There are certainly aspects of the Torah like that. Clearly, there are moral elements to the Torah which would have weight, or quite possibly have weight, even beyond, or were the Torah not to instruct them. However, this doesn't seem to fit everything in the Torah. There is, by the way, an ancient version of this question, which is found in one of Plato's dialogues. It's gone down in the history of philosophy as the Euthyphro dilemma. Socrates asks someone this question. The figure he asks, Euthyphro, is therefore has given his name to this dilemma, and he basically says: is it moral or pious to love the gods because it is moral, or is it moral because it is what the gods want? Meaning to say, why do we need to listen in the context of the Greeks to the gods? Do the gods want this because it is moral, or is it moral because the gods want it? And neither model seems to work that well. Let's translate this immediately into monotheistic terms. Let's not spend time on pagan ways of talking. Is something moral and correct because Hashem has instructed it? In which case we can ask ourselves the question, how does it become moral and correct because he has instructed it? Or is it, does he instruct it because it is moral and correct? And each one has problems. If it is moral and correct because he instructed it, how does his instruction make it moral and correct? And if he instructs it because it is moral and correct, then he is in a sense a prisoner to the moral code rather than the source of morality. So this is a dilemma that already bothered the Greeks in a pagan setting, and it's a problem that remains in understanding the authority of Torah to this day. And in a sense, before we can expect a reasonable answer to understand the authority of Chazal, we need to consider this question. So what I would like to do next week is to consider the source of authority of the Torah itself, and this will lead to a fascinating discussion, and then from that go back to the context of DeRabbanans and try and understand them. So I've run out of time for today. I will conclude for today. Forgive me that I'm not able to stay on more than 1 minute because of the timing if there are questions. And to Hashem, next week we'll continue this topic.